today, our first talk today is titled A Plea for Descriptive Social Ontology by Kathrin, Koslicki, and Olivier Massin.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for listening to our presentation. So we're going to present to you a talk entitled A Plea for Descriptive Social Ontology.
Sorry.
We want to put forward two different claims. Thesis one is that there are two different projects in social ontology, a descriptive and a foundational project. And thesis two is that the descriptive project is prior to the foundational project in the order of inquiry. And we're going to say a little bit more as we go on about what kind of priority we have in mind when we say that. Now, the plan for our presentation is we're going to first give you an analogy just to kind of help you get a grip on what we mean by this distinction between descriptive and foundational social ontology. And the analogy is going to come from descriptive psychology versus philosophy of mind. Then secondly, we're going to talk a little bit about how the descriptive foundational distinction can be made and has been made in general metaphysics. Thirdly, we're going to then take this distinction and apply it to social ontology. And in the final part of the talk, we're going to present some objections and tell you how we think we should reply to them.
Okay, so the first analogy, the analogy we want to introduce to contrast descriptive and foundational social ontology is a perhaps more familiar contrast between descriptive psychology and philosophy of mind. So there has been historically two contrasting approaches to the mind. In analytic philosophy of mind, we think it's fair to say that the work there has been mostly focused around the mind-body problem, the question of understanding, explaining the relation between mental states and brain processes. But there is a different tradition in philosophy of mind, sometimes called phenomenology, which we prefer to call with Brentano descriptive psychology, which has been producing a lot of works in philosophy of mind while remaining nearly silent about the mind-body problem and even trying to remain silent about the mind-body problem. Here is Brentano. Descriptive psychology will therefore, even in its highest state of perfection, never mention a physico-chemical process in any of its doctrines. And here is Reinach, who was a young pupil of Russell and who is, we think, peculiarly important for descriptive social ontology. But here he's speaking about a descriptive philosophy of mind. Descriptive psychology, Reinach writes, is that disciplines which strives to take an inventory of consciousness and to fix upon the various species of experiences as such. Descriptive psychology's aim is not to explain and to reduce to other things, not to explain and to reduce to other things. So we seem to have two very different projects here, and one question is whether they are rival or complement each other. We think the correct answer is that they complement each other. So our plea for descriptive social ontology is not a plea against foundational social ontology. But so if they complement each other, the question is how are they related? And our proposal, which we do not take to be original, is the following. Descriptive psychology fixes the explanandum of philosophy of mind. So descriptive psychology on that proposal is a descriptive project which aims at capturing mental phenomena as they appear to us by making explicit the various features, distinction, relations, similarities that those apparent mental phenomena exhibit. Philosophy of mind, on the other hand, is a foundational project which aims at explaining mental phenomena, in particular the relation between the mental and the physical, by appealing to identity, realizability, reduction, grounding, and other relations that have become familiar to us, which are not relations which are readily apparent to us. So one consequence of that explanatory model is that there is a priority of descriptive psychology over foundational or philosophy of mind, namely a priority in the order of inquiry. We should first describe mental states and then try to explain them and even explain them away for some foundational project. This leads us to stress one kind of fallacy which we should be aware of if we accept that general model, which we call the explanatory fallacy. This is the fallacy of letting explanatory consideration influence description of mental states. This is a fallacy because, kind of obviously, explanans should fit the explanandum, not the reverse. There are many forms of this explanatory fallacy. We just mentioned the first one here. If we end up embracing a description of mental states for the reason that that peculiar description paves the way for our favorite explanation, then we are guilty of that fallacy. So for instance, if we describe mental states in functional terms, emotion says in functional terms, just because we like functionalism and we think it provides the best account of the relation between the mind and the brain, then we are guilty of the explanatory fallacy. There are other forms of this fallacy, but I think we should skip them to come to the general metaphysics contrast we now want to draw between descriptive and foundational metaphysics. Kathrin, you have your mic off. It doesn't want to go on. Raphael, perhaps you can make Kathrin a co-host. It would solve the problem.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I couldn't turn my mic on. Okay, so now we're going to talk briefly about some background in general metaphysics about how this distinction that we want to draw between the descriptive and the foundational project has been drawn in the context of general metaphysics. So there's a tradition going back at least to Aristotle about saving the appearances, where we take the project of describing the appearances to be the descriptive project. There's similarly a tradition inspired by Wittgenstein and ordinary language philosophy. There is Strawson's famous distinction between descriptive versus revisionary metaphysics. And then Kit Fine has recently drawn a distinction between naive and foundational metaphysics. So we don't have time to talk about all of these predecessors in this talk, but just to mention briefly Strawson. So Strawson says in individuals, descriptive metaphysics is content to describe the actual content of our thought about the world. Revisionary metaphysics is concerned to produce a better structure. Ordinary language philosophers see descriptions as targeting ordinary linguistic practices, while Strawson views descriptions as bearing on our conceptual scheme, as the passage illustrates. Now, Kit Fine draws his distinction between naive and foundational metaphysics somewhat differently. This comes from a 2017 paper called Naive Metaphysics. He thinks that both the naive and the foundational approach are concerned with the nature of things by contrast to language or the structure of our thought, as we've just seen with relation to Strawson or ordinary language philosophy. Fine takes naive metaphysics to be prior in certain respects to foundational metaphysics. Naive metaphysics and foundational metaphysics are both directed towards the same world, but naive metaphysics is directed towards the appearances, that is how the world presents itself to us, while foundational metaphysics tries to discern the reality that lies behind these appearances. But you can pursue naive metaphysics more or less independently from foundational metaphysics. And naive here is not meant to signify ordinary or pre-philosophical for Fine, because he doesn't think that there is a clear distinction that can be drawn between what is and isn't philosophical. So just to summarize some of the main differences between the Strawsonian way and the Finean way of drawing this distinction between descriptive versus foundational or revisionary. So for Strawson, descriptive metaphysics aims at capturing our conceptual scheme, while for Fine, it aims at capturing the natures of things as they appear to us. Descriptive metaphysics contrasts with revisionary metaphysics for Strawson. For Fine, descriptive metaphysics contrasts with foundational metaphysics. We actually like the Finean approach to think of both the descriptive and the foundational project as being directed at the world and trying to capture the natures of things, but in different ways. We're not going to be able to defend this kind of essentialist commitment in this talk, but just as something that we are committed to in the background. Okay, now these two approaches have different targets, and therefore they also have different criteria for adequacy, and they require different kinds of skills. So descriptive metaphysics aims at producing descriptions. Foundational metaphysics aims at producing explanations. Good descriptions have to meet the following criteria of adequacy. They have to be adequate in the sense of fitting the appearances. They should be exhaustive in that we want to capture all of the distinctions and relations that are out there. But at that level, no parsimony is required. And it takes something like acuity or keenness of observation to come up with good descriptions. Whereas on the foundational level, a good explanation, so here the aim is explanation rather than description, and the criteria for success could be things like parsimony or powerfulness, depending on how you view explanation. And here the kind of skill that's required would be, for example, ingenuity to try to come up with an explanatorily powerful framework on the basis of very few components, if you accept something like parsimony or simplicity as a constraint on good explanations. Okay, now we said before that we think that the descriptive project is prior in certain respects to the foundational project, and this is something that we agree on with Fine. Now, what senses of priority do we have in mind? Well, for one thing, there's just plain temporal priority. So we think it's kind of obvious that you should start by describing the phenomena that even if at the end you want to explain them, but you should start, temporally speaking, by giving a good description of what you're trying to explain. Epistemically speaking, it seems that in order to explain something, you have to at least have a good grasp of what it is that you're trying to explain. Otherwise, it seems really difficult to see how you could possibly come up with a good explanation. But what we want to leave open is whether there is some kind of ontological priority to the appearances as opposed to the reality that lies behind these appearances. So it could, as far as the descriptive project is concerned, it could be that the appearances are grounded in the physical, but perhaps the physical is grounded in the appearances. Perhaps there's no grounding relation between them at all. But to commit to one of these claims would be part of the foundational project. And this is something that should be left open when you're still just concerned with giving an adequate description.
Okay, so we have now introduced the distinction between the descriptive and the foundational, first with respect to philosophy of mind and to general metaphysics. And what we want to do now is to apply that distinction to social ontology. So what we want to call descriptive social ontology is a project that aims at describing the social world as it appears to us. Foundational social ontology, on the other hand, aims at explaining those social appearances. And there are many ways in which those explanation can go. So for instance, one kind of explanation can be reduction, and in particular, reduction of the social phenomena of facts to non-social phenomena of facts. So this is one foundational route one can take. But you also are doing foundational social ontology if you argue that social phenomena are irreducible to non-social phenomena, be they individual phenomena, psychological phenomena, biological phenomena, whatsoever. So we are not saying that foundational social ontology is necessarily reductionist. Anti-reductionist is also a foundational claim. You can also explain some social phenomena in terms of other more basic social phenomena. So argue, for instance, that collective intentionality is the basic social phenomena which explain all other institutional facts or whatever. Or you can refuse to do that. Again, these are two foundational claims. You can use some non-reductive realization constitution to explain the relation between the social and the non-social. You can use emergence. So there are many ways in which you can endorse a foundational project. Now, who has been doing foundational social ontology? It seems to us that analytic social ontology first typically fails to explicitly distinguish the two projects, even if the distinction is often in the background, it's not really salient. But in most of its endeavors, it endorses a foundational project. So we just mentioned 3 examples here. So Starts is in famous theory of social ontology by saying that he wants a naturalist account. I mean, just saying that is already taking that naturalist commitment puts you really on the foundational project. And then he argued that we can explain institutional facts by grounding them in collective intentionality. Francesco Guala and Frank Hendricks have been developing over the last years a nice account of social phenomena in terms of institutions, which they equate to rules in equilibria by using various tools of game theory. Here again, we have clearly a foundational project. That is, there is a wide area of social phenomena, variety of social phenomena, which we try to explain by just one single set of game theoretic tools. Right? A few exponents explained a lot of explananda. Margaret Gilbert, also an influential models in social ontology, has been using joint commitment, which are themselves social phenomena, but to explain a wide variety of other social phenomena, such as promises. So in all those cases, the goal is clearly to explain, ground, analyzes, reduces some or all social phenomena to some more basic phenomena, be they social or non-social. So now descriptive social ontology, can we give example of works that have been done in that area? We do not think that descriptive social ontology has been very popular within analytic philosophy, and this is one of our goal here to say that there is some interesting work to be done in that area, but there are clearly some precursor in the same Brentanian tradition that we were mentioning in the first part. So Adolf Reiner, in a neglected but very nice book, we think, The A Priori Foundation of the Civil Law, has been given a descriptive account of speech acts, promising, ordering, granting, informing, submitting, and others, and of legal phenomena such as ownership, rights, obligation, representation. Max Scheler, in his Formalism in Ethics and the Non-Formal Ethics of Value, gives a descriptive account of varieties of social unities, herds, communities, societies, collective persons, and so on. Edith Stein has been in her book An Investigation Concerning the State, Sociality, Nationhood, Ethics, gives, amongst other things, descriptive accounts of the states, of the sovereignty of the states, of the action of the states, and how the state enacts law. So there are some precursors, and we think there are still some works to be done in that area. Now, one question, and this is one slide we have introduced after Francesco and Frank talked yesterday, is that so far it may seem that we subscribe to a model that Francesco and Frank have been rightly criticizing, namely the model that there is on the one hand folk social ontology, and on the other hand there is the social ontology of philosophers, and the task of social ontology is to explain folk social ontology. So we want to make clear that we do not subscribe to that model, and that the way we conceive of descriptive social ontology is really broader than just restricting it to folk social ontology. So first, the first thing we want to make clear about that is that descriptive social ontology is not done only by philosophers. In fact, we think that any social scientist is making some descriptive claims, or at least some descriptive assumptions, which sometimes remain tacit. We just mentioned one example here, but there are many others. Here is how Menger starts his famous paper on the origin of money. So he says we have to explain. So this is what he sets out to do. So it is a foundational goal. What do we want to explain is why it is that the economic man is ready to accept a certain kind of commodity, that is money, even if he does not need it. So there is a descriptive claim here, namely people exchanges some goods which are immediately useful to them for some other goods, metal discs, which apparently are not useful to them. This is a descriptive claim. It's not especially interesting nor illuminating, but this is what we want to explain. So this is, and this is not done by a philosopher, even if one could argue that Menger was perhaps a philosopher. Second thing we want to make clear here is that descriptive social ontology does not consist only of a priori claim. And going back to Menger's example, the fact that people exchange commodity against money is not an a priori claim, nor is it a claim that we have gathered by empirical observation, like a collection of data, big studies, and so on. This is something we can all reasonably accept, and which calls for an explanation. So there are some claims within descriptive social ontology that are not a priori. We also want to include within descriptive social ontology all the data gathered by social scientists. For instance, data about the evolution of global extreme poverty, about the evolution of racial prejudice, about some group being underrepresented in some area or some fields, whatever. So all those data belongs to descriptive social ontology. We have those data and we want to explain how is it, for instance, that global extreme poverty has dropped, or other phenomena. So this is really the things that we need to describe first before wondering about the explanation of those things. And I fear that we are going to be late, but so I won't go in details here, but we do not think that false theories exhaust social ontology, partly for the reason we just mentioned, but there are many other aspects of social ontology, of descriptive social ontology, which do not pertain to folk theories. Now, you might wonder, still, if we do not gather data, if we do not make empirical studies to study whatever, the evolution of poverty, on which ground do we have to say that something appears to be socially in a certain way? That the problem is, the problem is a bit an asymmetry between descriptive psychology and descriptive social ontology. In the case of descriptive psychology, we have a reasonable answer to the question of how can you describe your mental states prior to try to explain them? And typically the answer is something like introspection, inner perception, inner observation. Also, there are a lot of methodological issues with such answer, of course, but at least there is a candidate answer. It's unclear what is the candidate answer in the case of descriptive social ontology. Do we have a social sense by which we can observe the social world? So our answer here is kind of disappointing because we don't know what the correct answer is, but it seems to us that on top of the data that we can empirically gather, there is a bunch of claims which seems to us very plausible, which are not necessarily easy to get at, but which it would be very problematic for any foundational project to contradict. And we want to mention just a few of them to hopefully convince you that there is a lot we know about the social worlds, or seem to know about the social world before we enter the foundational project. Let's start with very boring and trivial things. A city is not a duck. We are pretty certain that it's not the case. We are pretty certain that if a foundational theory arrives and entails that cities are ducks, we have a good grounds to say that there is a problem with the foundational theories because it contradicts such an obvious and boring claim. Let us move to perhaps a bit more interesting one. Inflation cannot laugh. No discussion is a precedent. It is possible to have money in one's pocket. Ownership is a relation that has at least two places between a person and a thing. Promises generate claims and obligation. A claim ceases to exist when its content is realized. One can renounce a claim, but one cannot renounce an obligation. Revolution, tournaments, economic crises are occurrence. Theater, countries, civil codes are continuance. Note that occurrence and continuance are theoretical terms here, and it's fine to have theoretical terms within descriptive ontology. Descriptive ontology is a theoretical project. The appearances is described may be very simple and may be called for, the correct description may call for the introduction of kind of theoretical terms. Property rights can be transferred. Money can be transferred, good can be owned, services cannot be owned, money can be owned, teams, family, committees have members, money, constitution, walls have no members. Some social phenomena that lack members have participants, namely, for instance, wars, meetings, tennis game. Some social phenomena have neither member nor participants, for instance, money or civil codes. Some social phenomena are intended, for instance, a new law, a building. Some are partly intended, for instance, states, city. Some are fully unintended, for instance, traffic jam or pollution. Family, masses, community, society are distinct kinds of group, and so on and so on. We now turn to address three objections to that general picture. The first one is immunity to revision, triviality, and explanatory description. So immunity to revision is the following worry. So the model we propose is an explanatory model. And in the sense that we claim that descriptive social ontology, broadly construed, give us our explanandum. And we insist that the explanation cannot contradict the explanandum. So it seems that one immediate entailment of our theory is that the foundational inquiry can never contradict, can never lead to revision in descriptive metaphysics, right? The second premise of the objection is that this is kind of obviously false. Very often foundational inquiries lead to descriptive revisions. Just to mention one common example here. So we want to explain jade, why jade is a natural kind, and then we end up discovering that jade is not a natural kind, but in fact consists of two kinds of minerals, nephrites and jadeite. So it seems that for that reason, our model is false. So how do we answer this objection? The first thing is that we want to stick to our gun, is that in the following respect, we do believe that it's impossible for an explanation to contradict its explanandum. It seems to us that it would not make sense in the least. But this is still possible in the course of searching for an explanation to arrive at consideration that undermine our initial explanandum. For instance, when we look to explain why all jade instances are of the same kind, and this is our initial description, we discover that jade is in fact not a natural kind, but consists in either jadeite or nephrite. So what we discovered is not an explanation of what we, our initial description, even is in fact something which contradicts our initial description and which leads to the revision of the description. And we are absolutely fine with that. I think we think it's happened very often that the foundational project lead us to revise the descriptive project. Now, there are two ways in which that revision could occur, which we want to quickly mention. The first way in which you can go for a revisionary metaphysics on the basis of foundational discoveries or consideration is to blame the initial appearance as deceptive. So in such a case, you say that the jade instances appears to be of the same kind, but we have discovered that they are not. So initial appearance was an illusion. So of course, we do not have to explain the content of illusions. The only thing we have to explain is why such illusions occurs. So this is typically what error theorists are doing. But there's another route which we want to mention because it seems to us to be very often, at least, and often more interesting than the former one. It is not to blame the appearance, the initial appearance, but the initial description of the appearance as deceptive. So the proposal here is the following. Our initial description was all jade instances are of the same kind. And one way to go once we discovered that there is a distinction between jadeite and nephrite is that this description, in fact, was going beyond appearances. So strictly speaking, what appears to us right from the start is not that all jade instances are of the same kind, but that, for instance, that all jade instances share certain similarities, colors, texture, whatever. And now that appearances, which is more properly defined, which has been redescribed in a better way, it still provides a worldly explanandum for other explanation. How is it that jade instances share similarities? And this is still something that needs to be explained. So this is not an error theories. We do not just have to explain illusion here, but we have to explain something about the world.
Okay, we're going to briefly mention two other objections, and I won't go into great detail because we want to leave enough time for discussion. So the second objection is the triviality objection. And it's the objection that you might wonder whether the descriptive project is even valuable at all. You might think, isn't it really easy to get at the appearances? And so why do we even need a lengthy investigation to look into the appearances when the appearances are just there for us to be described? But it turns out that even though descriptive claims are trivial, but they can nevertheless be difficult to get at, and we've already given some examples for this. Sometimes appearances are so familiar that they are difficult to notice and for us to describe because we're so used to them. But at the same time, as we've illustrated, we still think that doing the descriptive project well is really important. It's, of course, a bad idea to contradict trivialities, but we also need the descriptive project to fix the thing that we're trying to explain so that we can then move on to the foundational project. Now, an example of this is the theory of money that has been given by Guala in a 2021 paper, where he argues that money is not an object, but an institution, namely a system of rules. So that seems to contradict a claim that we've used on the earlier slide as an example of a descriptive claim. So for example, in ordinary context, we say things like, we can have money in our pocket, but of course we can't have rules in our pockets. So there seems to be this conflict between the foundational theory of money that is being offered and the descriptive claims that we ordinarily make about money. Now, there's different kinds of ways to resolve this apparent tension. And one would be to simply drop the descriptive claims to say, well, we might think that we can have money in our pockets, but upon scrutiny, once we have the foundational theory lined up, then it turns out that actually we can't have money in our pockets. So upon reflection, we should probably stop saying these things. But on the other hand, we can also then clarify ambiguities. For example, we can distinguish between money in the sense of what does the instituting versus money in the sense of what is being instituted. And we can then say that Guala's theory might work very well for money in the sense of what does the instituting. But when we ordinarily say things like we can have money in our pockets, what we mean is money in the sense of what is being instituted rather than what is doing the instituting. And this kind of disambiguation move is very compatible and makes a lot of sense from the descriptive point of view, and it's been done in other contexts as well. Okay, now briefly, the third objection is that you might think that our approach is mistaken because it seems like descriptive projects can often, or descriptive claims can often already contain explanations. And so it seems wrong to think that there's this priority between the descriptive and the explanatory project. But here we want to say that, you can go to the next slide. Here we want to say that we should distinguish between merely describing an explanatory relationship versus actually providing an explanation. So a descriptive claim can contain, for example, in virtue of, or because, or we can even use, terms like grounding as part of the descriptive project. But what we're doing there is merely describing what seems to be an explanatory relation. And then to actually provide the explanations is part of the foundational project. Okay, we can go into this in more detail if people are interested in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, we want to wrap up now. So what we've presented to you, hopefully in this talk, is a distinction between a descriptive and a foundational project that has been drawn in other contexts, such as psychology and the philosophy of mind, as well as general metaphysics. And we want to apply this distinction to social ontology and say that even though foundational social ontology is no doubt a worthy endeavor, but its success crucially depends on an accurate description of its explananda. And for that reason, social ontology, which has been to a large extent driven by the desire to give a foundational theory, would benefit from a greater emphasis on the descriptive project. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. So now it's time for the Q&A. Please use the chat, Q for a question, F for a follow-up. So first question goes to Don Ross.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed your talk. I think it's good to have made that distinction. I certainly support the campaign in favor of descriptive ontology rather than foundational ontology. But just with reference to your last slide and to several things you said, at one point you referred to when you were considering objections that might be made by a foundationist. You said at one point you were going to stick to your guns. It seems to me there are stronger and better guns worth sticking to here. I see no reason to make any concession to the foundational program at all. I mean, it seems to me where foundational work is, with the very idea of foundations as it features in this program are concerned, the person who has come closest to articulating the best response over the last few decades is Rorty, right? That is, there's just no reason to believe that anything has foundations at all. I mean, that the whole foundational program is simply projection. It's a combination of two things. It's projection of an everyday metaphor, the idea that the use of this made of metaphor, where walls are made of bricks and IKEA furniture is made of the components of those things. It's a crazy projection of this very parochial, limited relationship on grandiose scales to try and the scale of our old knowledge of reality, which is things just plain preposterous. The only reason I think it ever seemed sensible is because there was a certain conception of the relationship between the sciences that made a certain amount of, that was compelling for a little while in the 19th century, given the particular way science evolved, beginning with the successes in mechanics. That it's been obviously wrong for pretty much the whole of the 20th century. And it seems to me this progress has made no progress in adding to our knowledge about anything at all. So, I mean, why? But you seem to be making lots of concessions to the foundational project. And I guess I don't think that can work. If you make any concessions, you're lost, I think. So that's my...
Thanks that I'm answering to Don, Kathrin, and you interrupt me if you want to complete or disagree. Our answer has to be that Rorty's view, which you just mentioned and endorse, that nothing has foundation at all, for us, it's a foundational view in itself. So we don't want to. Our point was not to choose between reductionist and non-reductionist. So we just want to distinguish different kinds of projects. If you go with descriptive ontology, you're really mute with respect to, are those appearances grounded or not? Are they reducible or not? Is holism true, or is social individualism true? I mean, this is something you are not interested in. And then we would argue that Rorty's answer belongs to the foundationalist project. It's basically a denial of there being foundation for social appearances.
Okay, I mean, I don't think that's an adequate reply, but that takes us to huge questions in metaphilosophy. So,
okay,
at least you've clarified where you stand. That's what I was hoping you would do. So thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Next question goes to Manuel Gustavo Isaac.
Hi there. Thanks to both for the fascinating talk, to me, very illuminating. So my question is regards the relationship between the both component of your dichotomy. And I wonder whether instead of construing them as a priority relationship between one and the other, we should conceive, and especially in light of the objection that you addressed, the first and the second one towards the end of the talk, whether we should conceive of them in terms of some sort of back and forth or continuous equilibrium between both components, because you can then revise your descriptive claim when you kind of discover that they were inadequate and so on. So I wanted to have your feeling on this itself, is if it's okay. Thanks very much.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, so as I think the Jade example illustrates, depending on how exactly you deal with the immunity from revision objection, it seems that sometimes once we are further along in the foundational project, that then it can actually, the foundational project can then go back to the descriptive claims and either reject certain claims that we initially made, or at least refine our understanding of how they should be interpreted. So, for example, we used Guala's theory of money and the claim that you can have money in your pocket, right? You can then, once you have a foundational theory of money, you can then go back to the descriptive claim and either reject it, or you can offer a disambiguation of how it should be understood in light of your foundational theory. So while there is this priority relation, there's the temporal priority, there's the epistemic priority. First, you have to describe what you're trying to explain. You have to have a grasp of what it is that you're trying to explain in order to give a good explanation. But once you have the explanation, then I think you can go back and either correct the description or refine it in certain ways. So I don't think they're quite on a par, the descriptive and the foundational project. So that's why we went for priority relations instead.
All right, we have 4 questions left and about 12 minutes left, so please try to be brief. Next question goes to Frank Hendricks.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I have a question about what you take descriptive metaphysics to be, because it seems that you throw 2 different things under that label. So one would be like folk conceptions, folk intuitions, the way the folk talk about phenomena, social phenomena. And the other is the data that social scientists try to explain. And they are not the same. Scientists have their own methods of measuring and constructing of constructing data and formulating constructs that might play a role in explanation. And they might, in some cases, they bypass the way folk think about social phenomena altogether. So I was wondering how that fits into your framework.
Yes, thanks, Frank. You're right. There is a strong heterogeneity between those 2 kind. We would call them 2 kind of data, in the sense 2 kind of things we want to explain. So let's call them folk data and empirical data. Or I'm not sure about the label, right? So it's true they are not the same, but they are nevertheless on the same side, because they are both things which we want to explain afterwards. And it seems to us that even in sciences, in empirical sciences, we don't just have data like bunch of observation with a lot of empirical studies. We also have data which we kind of know from the start. And when we say know from the start, we do not mean to have anything in mind, such as necessary armchair a priori. This is why we took the Meagher example. So the fact that people exchange good against money, it seems we know that, and it seems this is something we have to explain. We do not need to launch a big empirical studies about whether it is indeed the case that people buy stuff with money. I mean, it is clear to us from the start, and it's a perfectly legitimate explanandum. Sometimes explanandum requires to make some studies, right? Evolution, underrepresentation of a particular kind of group in a particular areas. You cannot get that. We do not know that from the start, but we want to put them on the same side, because both are kind of things we want to explain. And we want to insist that even in social sciences, we make at least tacit assumption about the kind of data, which you call folk theory. We are not sure it's just folk theory, but kind of assertion claims that we do not want to contradict in our explanation.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thanks.
Next question goes to Douglas. Douglas Purpura. Sorry. I have to unmute you. Sorry, Douglas, you have to unmute.
Yeah.
Now.
Yes. I liked your paper, found it very helpful. My question is kind of like Frank's. I'm a sociologist, so you don't really say much about the status either of what the social sciences are doing. Is it all descriptive? And what about our explanations? Not just data, but our explanations. Marx's argument that changes in the relations of production follow changes in the forces of production. What's the status of that? That's my question.
Kathrin, you don't say anything, so I guess this is because you want me to answer. Can you, sorry, which claim of Marx you mentioned, changes in the relation?
Well, I'm just looking for some kind of social explanation of something.
Yeah.
That, okay, you could take something else, is the fact that African Americans in the United States do worse on COVID than white people is due to structural racism. That's an explanation of a datum. So
yes.
What is the status in your topology of that kind of explanation?
Yeah, so thanks. So the status is the following. So the fact you described, so African American do worse in the COVID time, that falls on this descriptive side, right? This is something which we do not know from the archer, but which requires some empirical studies to show. So this is something we want to explain. And now one explanation is the one you mentioned, structural racism. Other explanations are on the table, and this fall on the other side. So, I mean, in a way, our point is very trivial. It is that in any explanatory project, you have to distinguish what you want to explain from your explanation of it. But where our point is not completely trivial is that we have the feeling that the description of what you want to explain is sometimes a bit neglected, that we rush a bit too quickly to the explanation, and we don't spend enough time describing properly our explanandum. Right?
Yeah, I might just add, so I think it's useful to think about Aristotle in this connection, and how Aristotle thinks about what he means by saving the appearances. So it's important not to mistake the descriptive for the pre-theoretical, right? This already came out in the last exchange. So for example, when Aristotle sets out to give an analysis of change in the physics, he spends the book one of the physics going over all of the theories of change that had already been offered by his pre-Socratic predecessors, including Parmenides' claim that change is impossible, but also the ordinary claim that change appears to be happening all the time. So all of these things are part of the appearances, right? The appearances are going to contain descriptions of theories that have been offered by your predecessors, including claims that that you make about how the world appears to you, and all of that gets thrown into the initial basket of data, and that basket is going to include inconsistencies. For example, the claim that change appears to be happening all the time, and the claim that change is impossible. And then you move on, as you move on from the descriptive to the foundational project, part of what you try to do is to resolve these inconsistencies.
Okay, next question goes to Francesco Guala.
Yeah, I guess it's a sort of a continuation of this discussion about the nature and the status of appearances, or, you know, these facts, these descriptive facts that you start from. And, you know, I've tried to collect some of these descriptive facts, for example, in some work that I've done with a psychologist. You know, one of the things that happen is that you often don't get, I mean, it's not clear for whom certain facts are facts. And, you know, if you ask people certain very basic questions like, money is something that you can keep in your pocket, many people will say yes, even though it's pretty obvious there are kinds of money like bitcoins that I cannot keep in my pockets, right? Other people are going to say no, because they have in mind the example of bitcoins. Or even worse, you know, if you say to somebody, money is something that you can put in your bank account, do you agree with that? Pretty much everyone, I expect, will say, yes, of course. But that's not true. Okay? Because what ends up in your bank account is not the money that you had in your pocket, and even being in your bank account is a peculiar idea, right? So I'm kind of worried about this. I mean, I guess what Kathrin just said is that, well, we have some kind of pre-theoretical ideas about this, but then why do all this data collection? Why collect all these weird facts which are not facts at all? I mean, you start from some ideas about what money is, some sensible theoretical ideas about what money is, and then you focus on the data that makes sense, which is exactly what you do when you do empirical science or experiments. You don't just take any data that are thrown out there. I mean, you focus on data that you think are good data that you can reliably use for theorizing.
Thanks, Francesco. That's very helpful. So there is a question about what the good data are, even for folk data, right? I mean, it's not easy to capture folk intuitions. So it's not just a matter of gathering empirical data. It's just what do we ordinarily think money is? Which claim do we have about money? And this is why here we try to be careful in the way we phrase the claim we wanted to oppose to your view. So the way we phrase the claim is not you can have money in your pocket. The way we phrase the claim is it's possible to have money in one's pocket. So it's meant to leave open that all kind of money can be had in our pocket. So there are some kinds of money that you can have in our pockets, clearly not Bitcoins. I mean, perhaps there are also some physical cases of Bitcoins now. But so we take this to be a pressure to be very specific and precise in those description. And the kind of mistake we kind of worry that we shouldn't be doing is that because we have a poor description or a kind of imprecise description of the appearances, we rush too quickly to the view, no, but folk psychology on this is completely false. I mean, that there are some types of money that we can have in our pocket. I don't think you are going to find a lot of empirical evidence when you studied that, people claiming, no, it's not the case. You think it's a case?
All right, it's 11 o'clock, we are out of time, and let's thank the speakers for a wonderful session.
Thank you.
Now I guess it's time for the next talk. If I remember well, Francesco, are you chairing the next talk?
We're going to have a break, aren't we? Raphael.
Yep.
Raphael, we're going to have a break, aren't we?
It's up to you. You're the chair.
Okay, I think it's probably good if we have like 3 minutes break, right? So people can do whatever they want for 3 minutes.